Hello, everyone. This is Matthew Kapitas hosting Path for Progress's Cubic Dimensions, Season 2, Episode 1. Yeah, I've renamed them if you haven't noticed. So, real quick before we get started, I just want to say we've obviously noticed the decline in viewership and the decline in subscriptions to Path for Progress, and then, of course, views for Cubic Dimensions. So, we're looking to try to help that. If anybody has any suggestions as how we may improve the show, we definitely like any feedback of that kind. Definitely going to try to advertise it more, get it more out there, get people that I know that are into politics to watch it more. Anyway, Christian and I should be having a discussion on that sometime soon, hopefully. Unfortunately, he is not able to make it to tonight's show, and I, unfortunately, was not able to prepare well for this, despite it being winter vacation. It's been pretty busy, especially with a storm that just hit the Cape, so that's always fun. So I'm going to try to wing it. Now, I'm going to open with a story about who Democrats are targeting for their nomination processes. I know that today there was an article that Sherrod Brown has said he will definitely vote against Jeff Sessions for Attorney General. So there's that. Although that's not entirely surprising considering what kind of positions that Sherrod Brown holds. Also, very big news that what's her face? Megyn Kelly is leaving Fox News to go to NBC, I believe, which is an interesting move. I can understand it, given what happened with Roger Ailes, even though he's left now. I would not want to work there any longer either, if I were her. So, Senate Democrats have publicly announced that they're planning to target 8 of President-elect Trump's cabinet picks. Charles Schumer has said that, and has said it to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. They are targeting the 8. They're targeting are Rex Tillerson, nominee for Secretary of State; Jeff Sessions for Attorney General; Mick Mulvaney for OMB; and Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary; Tom Price for Health and Human Services; Andrew Puzder for Labor Secretary; Stephen Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary; and finally Scott Pruitt for EPA. So it's definitely encouraging that Democrats are setting up this kind of fight, because obviously there was a lot of anger, frustration, confusion about how after the election, initially Democrats were like, yeah, we need, well, first shock, of course, and then we need to take down Trump. And then a lot of congressional Democrats said, oh, we have to work with Trump. Hillary Clinton said that. Even Bernie Sanders said that initially. Though the good thing is they seem to be going back on their word on that. A lot of them, obviously Chuck Schumer, who's the leader, going to be the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, or is now, I believe, yes. That's obviously a much better showing of their attitude toward this. I believe we talked about this earlier, but maybe not, about how top Democrats like Schumer and Reid are backing Keith Ellison for DNC chair, while simultaneously Bernie Sanders is supported Chuck Schumer for Senate Minority Leader. Very interesting dynamic there, and I think it definitely helps Democrats, at least in terms of the politicians, to get reunited after the very divisive campaign, and they really hadn't made it there yet by the time the election day rolled around. But since then, they've shown a great showing of unity and good deal making within the party in order to present a united front against Donald Trump. I, for one, have been an advocate as of late to have an umbrella group to combat Trump, and unfortunately, I don't know how that is going to work because that requires a lot of time for people to be putting in, and this is coordinating dozens upon dozens of organizations that want to oppose Trump vigorously. The ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, obviously the Democratic Party and its state and local affiliates, uh, the NAACP, just a lot of groups, and you need a figure at the head of that, or you need someone at least trying to coordinate the efforts of those organizations to make them effective at the most maximum point. It's we can't just count on our Democratic congressmen and Democratic senators to oppose Trump, because the first things first is that even if they do, a lot of stuff that he wants can get passed anyway. It's it's about the will of the people. It's about the pressure of voters. Most of the time, politicians only respond to vigorous opposition by their constituents. So if there is something, and to that point, if there is something going through Congress, regardless of what it is, who's supporting it, but obviously for us, our main target is Donald Trump and his efforts, you need to be calling your congressmen and your senators every day. You need to be pushing them to vote against it. I, for one, don't have to worry about that really. I have a Democrat as my congressman and two Democratic senators, both fairly progressive, and my congressman is fairly anti Trump. So I don't really have to worry about that. But it's critical, especially if you live in red states, especially if you live in districts where Trump won big on election day. That is very important because the one thing that is really scaring, especially Republican congressmen and senators, is a challenge in 2018 or 2020 or 2022 or whenever the next election is, from a Trump supporter and losing in a primary or even losing in a general to a Trump supporter. Pardon me, however that works. And, just because he's popular with the base. By the time his track got running onto the nomination, the vast majority of the voting people in the Republican Party voted for Donald Trump, and there are some states that a lot of states that traditionally went blue that went for him. So it's very important that you make sure they know what's going on. Another big story this week is, of course, is House Republicans setting up to gut the office on. No, it's the. I'm sorry, I don't want to get this wrong and sound like an idiot, like I do now. The Office of Congressional Ethics. Which is a government watchdog, obviously specifically aimed at Congress. And you can see how funny it is that they would want to defund and get rid of their own watchdog. Like, it's it's just hilarious. Like, they think they can brazenly get away with this shit, and of course they didn't. I want to say a day later, 2 days later, they immediately went back on it, mainly because the president-elect spoke out against it. Interestingly enough, House Speaker Paul Ryan and House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy both said that they're against it for obvious reasons. And here's the thing. I read an interesting article. Unfortunately, I can't find it again. On the reasoning to why they supported this. They didn't simply do it just because they want to get away with corruption. Obviously, that's part of it. But a journalist talked to an anonymous congressman who said, of course, something like this, because in my opinion, a lot of my fellow congressmen have been targeted unfairly. And a lot of them feel for those congressmen and feel that this government watchdog is overstepping its bounds, which is understandable. I get that thinking, but you're still wrong. They can paint this in the best light they want to. They can make this look like, hey, we did this to save the world. It doesn't really matter. It's a bad idea because no matter how you spin it, it looks like an awful decision to people. It's really just it doesn't look good. It doesn't matter how you frame it. It doesn't look good. And then on the other side, point B, it's a stupid idea to begin with. Okay, so if you congressmen are targeted unfairly or unjustly by the Office of Congressional Ethics, well then you have someone come in, I don't know what appropriate body it would be, any sort of court, come in and say, you guys overstepped your bounds, don't do that. And unfortunately, you're going to have oversight on them. But for all the shit that happens in Washington nowadays, God forbid congressmen get dragged through the mud while we find all of the bad ones, right? Because guarantee you that most of the time when the Office of Congressional Ethics investigates a congressman vigorously, they end up being justified in that. I don't necessarily have numbers on that, but I'd imagine that's the case. I don't know. Someone can prove me wrong. Another interesting story is that as part of this rapid slate of legislation that the newly sworn in Congress is dealing with, well, one thing that they passed was a bill that would make it essentially a felony, or federal crime, I should say, to have live streaming on the House floor. And this is clearly in response to the sit-in to a year ago, or a few months ago, a year ago, by many Democratic congressmen, including, I believe, Elijah Cummings, or no, I'm sorry, John Lewis. Elijah Cummings may have been in there too, Catherine Clark, and a few others. And they staged a sit-in on the House floor to protest the Republican Congress not doing much about gun control, and that was a great PR stunt for them. It really made the House Republicans look stupid. And now they're just gonna casually pass this because they don't want to look like idiots again. And here's the thing. They wouldn't have done this if they thought they were right on guns. Right? They wouldn't have done this unless they recognize that a lot of the stuff they're going to be doing is unpopular. You could make the argument that it's kind of like the Office of Congressional Ethics thing, and it's just that certain things that they know are good that they want to push could be misinterpreted. And that's a fairly good argument. But here's the thing. A good politician doesn't do this. A good politician doesn't try to hide the truth and rush laws through for the good of the people in a deceptive manner unless it is absolutely crucial, and of course it would be misinterpreted. That is the only thing that happens, is that's all. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But my point is, you know what my point is. My point is that they wouldn't do this unless they knew some of the stuff they're doing is just outright unpopular and wrong. But they do it anyway because they know they can get away with it. And they want to get away with the stuff they want to pass. And they want no footage of any sort of stunt by Democratic congressmen to show how awful they're being at their jobs. Lovely. Oh, Ted Cruz has proposed a constitutional amendment to set term limits for Congress. 3 terms for House members, so 6 years, and 2 terms for senators, so 12. To which I say, what problem does that solve? Here's the thing: in government, this is where I may sound a little fiscally conservative. I don't know. I think it's just common sense that something should only be made into law if it fixes a problem, right? If it addresses an issue. Now, Ted Cruz is obviously doing this in the idea, or at least supporters of this are pushing it in the idea, if you set term limits for Congress people, they won't be worried about re-election so much, so they'll actually do decent work, at least towards the end of their career. That if there are corrupt politicians, then they'll just simply be term limited out. To which I say, okay, well, we have term limits on the governor of New Jersey. We have the term limits on president. That hasn't stopped Chris Christie, and that hasn't stopped Richard Nixon. What has stopped them is them resigning or falling into shame, getting ruined in the public eye, right? And those are guys who, other than, or at least with Richard Nixon, he was the guy who, other than the Watergate scandal and maybe Vietnam, did some pretty great things as president. And yet, despite having term limits, he still was corrupt, and he wasn't able to get away with it. Now, you're not going to catch every congressman and senator, obviously. And there is a problem with white-collar crime in this country, whether it's bankers and CEOs or it's politicians. That being said, term limits don't. So, like I said, term limits don't address the problem of corruption. They simply just force new people to run every 12 and 6 years for seats. It doesn't address the problem of there being districts that are gerrymandered that strongly favor one party over the other and keep the balance of power in Congress, in the House, pretty much the same. It doesn't address that issue. I don't know what how Ted Cruz thinks this fixes the issue, because it really doesn't. And I'd like someone to explain how it does, because honestly, I only had to think about it for 2 seconds and realized that it doesn't solve any of the problems. What solves the problem or at least mostly, is if we are able to get money out of politics, we need to publicly fund the. We need to publicly fund elections, campaigns, election campaigns. I'm saying, uh, and we need to crack down on the influence of donors and lobbyists. That's what we need to do, and we need a constitutional amendment for that. Not to set term limits for the House and Senate. And in a way, I want Ted Cruz to succeed just so we can see how much things don't change. Yeah, if you have term limits, maybe that prevents corrupt people from being in office too long, because maybe they're not caught until afterwards. But that's about the only thing it sort of kind of helps. Doesn't really help much else. And just because a congressman can only serve 3 terms, 6 years, doesn't mean and they're corrupt. Doesn't mean at the end of that term limit they won't run for the Senate, then stay in the Senate for 12 years. Still in the government a long time, and then maybe run for president and win for president, and stay in another 8 years, or vice president stay in another 8 years. It doesn't. I don't know. I think it's lunacy. Interesting article from The Hill. One thing why I really like The Hill is that, obviously, unlike other news sources, they're pretty much all about politics. So get a lot of specifics. So I'll read it really quick. A new poll finds majorities in red and purple states expect senators to be a, quote, check and balance to Republican President-elect Donald Trump. The poll, conducted for the Progressive Center for American Progress and published by the Washington Post, found that between 56 and 61% of voters in those states want their Democratic senator to be a, quote, check and balance to Trump. The survey of 1,206 voters was conducted in 14 states where Democratic senators are up for re-election in 2018. Quote, even in the states that Trump won handily, Democrats are in a good position, the organization's president, Neera Tanden, told the newspaper. Quote, 8 years ago, if you asked this question, people were much more inclined to say that everyone should get along. Here, you've got people who voted for Trump but want Democrats to block or oppose his agenda. That seems to be the new thing for American politics. Conducting the survey described the liberal proposals in a positive light. Voters said no to many of the Republican Party's goals of the new Congress. Would replace Medicare with private insurance, $2,000 more per year on average. 77% of respondents said no. 72% said they would not, quote, cut funding for Medicaid, which states use to provide health coverage for low-income individuals and for nursing years of the disabled. Tanden noted that the, quote, big cleavage in the coalition that voted for Trump, that's an interesting term to use. He won traditional Republicans, but his victory came from people who didn't vote Republican before and didn't support the party and don't support the party now. That's unique, she said. It also suggests that the election was not a mandate for a right-wing agenda, but right now Trump's misreading that with his cabinet picks. So this is a very good observation, I think. The big thing about Trump, and as I've said before, in a sort of similar way, like with Bernie Sanders, is that they don't rely on the typical party voter to elect them, right? You're not going to have a run-of-the-mill Democrat or Republican being at the forefront of the fight for Trump. You're having non-party voters who are a plurality of the voting population. even in elections, not just in terms of pure registration. So, and that's the sweet spot. That's what gets you. Republicans are always going to vote for you, as this said, no matter what, unless he, actually commits a Holocaust, which is highly unlikely. So he's going to have the traditional guys in the fold. What gets him elected is the people in the middle, and the people in the middle wanted something different. They wanted something new. That's why people who were so much more qualified than Donald Trump, I'm sorry, even Jeb Bush was more qualified than Donald Trump to be president. But the thing is that people didn't care about qualified this election. They cared about who talks like me, who speaks like me, who understands that uh, the system is broken and we need to fix it. And a lot of people fell into the fold with Donald Trump on that. Now, as I've noted before, and as should continually be noted, Trump's election wasn't a will of the people. Not only did he not have a mandate, he did not have a majority, as this article points out, he didn't even have a plurality. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but he managed to win the electoral vote. So to to that end, Donald Trump, as this article points out, doesn't have the mandate to be going around making these obscenely uh, absurd right-wing picks for the cabinet. It doesn't make sense, and I believe in opinion polls, most of them are very unpopular. Uh, Even though I know Trump was just trolling him, I think Mitt Romney as Secretary of State actually wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. I mean, when you come to a Republican president, there's going to be a Republican as Secretary of State, so you've got to pick within that lot, unfortunately. But in that lot, Mitt Romney isn't that bad. Significantly better than selecting Rex Tillerson. So, yeah, Trump's going about this the whole wrong way, and I find it very interesting that a lot of voters said that they wanted Democratic senators to be a check on Trump. Two things, and the article doesn't specify, but that could mean one of two things. Could mean A, that that Republican voters, and Trump voters want Democratic legislators to make sure Trump doesn't get out of hand. That he sticks by the sort of idea that I've heard a lot of Trump voters rationalize, I should say, or defend their votes and their support for him. Uh, that his campaign rhetoric was just that, campaign rhetoric, and he's not actually going to do a lot of the drastic things, such as a border wall and having a Muslim registry and a Muslim migration ban, that sort of thing. Uh, or it could be that most voters, as the popular vote bears out, don't actually like Trump and want their Democratic senators to be a check on him because they don't actually support him. The majority don't actually support him. Uh, Now, it really hard to say, and I don't think you'll really see the fruits of that bear until 2018. Now, if Democrats do really well in 2018, they pick up a lot of seats, and they're able to be in a better position to oppose Trump, then I'd say he simply just isn't popular enough. And I think that's the more likely scenario, considering that his approvals and his sort of honeymoon numbers, as they like to call them, the first 100 days, after the election and then the first 100 days in office, are considerably lower, even if some of them are positive, considerably lower than they were for previous presidents of all stripes. Even Bill Clinton, who was elected with a plurality, not with a majority, due to a significant third-party vote, even he had that grace period of when the majority of American voters thought that he could handle the job and thought that he was going to do at least reasonably well as a president, Democrats and Republicans alike. So Trump doesn't have that right now, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it goes down the road of Democrats end up doing really well in 2018 and possibly even in 2020, beating him because people end up not actually liking him. And that's a mistake I think a lot of people make, to bring it back to my earlier point about him winning plurality. Is, again, it's different than before. We've had the past two presidents, excluding President Obama, so Clinton and Bush, both were elected with pluralities of the vote. They did not win the majority. Or I'm sorry, Bill Clinton had a plurality, I believe, both in his election and re-election. Meanwhile, George W. Bush didn't even have a plurality, but he had very close to it. Al Gore actually had more votes. Those guys were elected with the majority of American voters, not even the majority of American people, just the majority of people who chose to vote and who had the ability to vote in those elections. They didn't want them in. That's the reality of the situation. And yet, and again, same thing with Bill Clinton's re-election. And yet they came into their presidency, they approached their presidency, they came into the presidency, and maintained for a while in both their presidencies very decent approval ratings and a lot of confidence and enthusiasm for their presidency before it started, even though, again, that they didn't win a majority of the votes. Here's the thing: Donald Trump didn't do that. He didn't even. It's not like George W. Bush, where it was just by a smidgen. He lost by a good 3 million. I think the count is now 3 million votes. 2.5 or something like that. 2.5 million. That's a lot. He just got lucky with how the electoral math worked out. And the majority of, not even the plurality, the majority of American voters did not approve of him. And he's going into this with low approval ratings and low expectations of how good he's going to do, even with the carrier deal. That is bad news for him. And I think he must be looking at that because he loves ratings. He must be looking at that and be breaking into very, very cold sweat, because that is the worst position you can be in right now. And if those numbers don't improve come 2018 and especially come 2020, Republicans are going to get slaughtered immensely. Now, that is also contingent upon Democrats mounting a decent opposition to them. I don't think that happened this year, or I'm sorry, last year, I should say. I don't think that happened 2 years ago. I think they were sloppy. I think they ran bad candidates a lot of the time, or their candidates were good but did poor jobs of running, and they did a poor job of, I really think, trying to get out the vote and encourage people to vote for their guys down to all the way from the Senate down to state representative. And I think they could have done a much better job of that. Unfortunately for them, they didn't. And unfortunately for us, they didn't. So we'll see how it works in 2018. And let's hope that the Democratic Party comes to its senses and actually does a decent job opposing Trump and eventually defeating him. But that's enough of that. Oh yeah, so hilarious moment. Uh, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn. She's from Tennessee. She's a Republican, and for a while has been speculated that she would run for president or be a running mate to a Republican nominee for president, or even uh, a cabinet pick for President-elect Trump. Well, she hasn't gotten that far yet, but she's still a favorite and a rising star within the Republican Party. And on either the third or fourth, so back, Monday, Tuesday ish, she tweeted out a Twitter poll asking what people thought of an Obamacare repeal, which we'll get to in a second. To be specific, it said, "Do you support the repeal of Obamacare?" Retweet if you do, and share what you want to see as the replacement. As of 10:47 a.m. on January 3rd, 2017, 16% said no. I'm sorry, 16% said yes, repeal it. 84% said no, don't repeal it. Those are the final results, it says, with 7,968 people voting. Now, obviously, that Twitter polls are not official. They're not any sort of decent poll. Uh, really, they don't mean much. But it's just funny to see. It's just funny to see something backfire so royally. And I want to say that either Speaker Ryan or another congressman did something similar and got a similar problem. So that's pretty amusing to me that uh, someone would be just expect to go to Twitter, the internet, and especially Twitter, and expect a more than disrespectful response. Just not going to happen. The House Republicans have pledged to obviously repeal and replace Obamacare, as they've talked about since before it was implemented. They've they said they're going to defund Planned Parenthood, which sounds absolutely fun. Great times. Not really. It's horrible. Why? I'm wondering what they think they get from this. Because as I said, there's a base of support, especially in coming elections, doesn't come from the typical Republican evangelical, stereotypical Republican voter. That's not what's going on anymore. Now you're aiming for the Trump voter. And the last thing that a typical working class person, especially that's a Trump voter, someone who votes for someone from the outside, is going to care about is Planned Parenthood. A lot of people are pro-life, but a lot of the time are pretty passive about it and don't really care. And the other half of the time, abortion never seems to be such a big election issue that Republicans lose in primaries or lose in generals to pro-life candidates because of how because of the abortion issue. It just doesn't happen. I get it; it's a hot button issue, but it just doesn't work like that. They're doing is just digging themselves into a hole, and how this doesn't hurt them, I don't know. Then again, we were saying similar things back in 2014, before 2016, for the elections, and yet we have a Republican Congress once again. So you never know. Luckily for Democrats, they picked up some seats. They actually netted, gaining, I think, a seat or two in the Senate elections. So that's good. I want to go back to that point about Senate and congressional seats and what I was talking about earlier over elections. That Democrats had a really good opportunity to win a lot of seats, a lot of very winnable seats this election, and they failed at it miserably. Right? Florida originally was open, which would have been easily winnable, but then Marco Rubio got back into it. But still, a winnable race. The first time he ran for that seat and won, he won like Bill Clinton, like Donald Trump, with a plurality of votes, not with a majority. And then that was because Charlie Crist ran against him, and he was the sitting governor at the time as well, as an independent, as well as a Democratic. There was a Democratic nominee, and that was during, pardon me, the Tea Party Revolution, and even he didn't muster up enough support to win a majority. And then this year, he came close to winning a majority of votes, but he didn't. He again won a plurality, and Patrick Murphy relatively comfortably, I want to say. I'll look up the results right now. And that's against a pretty pathetic Democratic candidate. And that's the other thing, is that Patrick Murphy was a horrible candidate to run against Marco Rubio. I personally supported Alan Grayson. I think he would have been better. I understand that there were legitimate issues between. Oh, I'm sorry. I looked at different results. Marco Rubio actually did win a majority, but only 52%. Murphy won 44.3, so that's a pretty good distance between the two. But in terms of getting a majority of the vote, that's not entirely comfortable for Rubio. In terms of solid numbers, he beat him by around 700,000 votes, give or take a few thousand. So, not exactly the most comfortable of margins, especially for someone who's supposed to be so popular and supposed to be the JFK of the Republican Party. Not working out well for him. And why Democrats couldn't muster a good candidate, which I think they had the opportunity with, to beat him, is beyond me. Same thing with Pat Toomey. Now, granted, I like Pat Toomey a little more than I like other Republicans. I also like Marco Rubio a little bit more, just based on issues, though he is a bit of a flip-flopper. Easily could have beaten him. Instead, they throw Katie McGinty against him, even though they could have put up Joe Sestak, who would have been much better in my opinion, or the other guy whose name I'm blanking on, who is the mayor of that town. He would have been a great candidate against Pat Toomey. And let me tell you, if they had run a decent candidate against him, like Joe Sestak, he would have won. That candidate would have won. What else? Wisconsin, Russ Feingold. What the hell was that? Russ Feingold at the beginning of the election, his opponent, who was an incumbent, was barely even scratching 30%, and then he ended up winning with the majority of the vote. How does that happen in a state like Wisconsin? That is completely unacceptable in this kind of race. Jason Kander was going up very well against Roy Blunt, a seemingly safe Republican, ended up losing significantly, but was leading in most polls leading into election day. What the hell is up with that? You guys give up these seats so easily that you could so easily have won. Same on governors. Colin Van Orsten, Sue Minter. What else? Chris Koster. just such and the guy in Indiana whose name I'm forgetting at the moment. Those seats would so easily be in your hands if you ran good candidates and you supported them well, and you actually had a message that resonated. It was too much talk with, oh, we gotta keep progressing like we have under President Obama. That's not a good line. Yes, President Obama is popular, but you don't get it with saying you don't win with saying we should keep things the way they are. Especially when polls come out day after day saying Americans are fed up with how the government is going right now. That was Hillary Clinton's whole message was we have to keep things the way they are, and Donald Trump's was no, the way they are is awful. That's why he won. And now, obviously, it's not true that he's staying to that promise because uh, you know, not really draining the swamp with his cabinet picks. But I'm in line with Bernie Sanders, who said earlier this week that Democrats really did lose because they're out of touch, because they're not actually listening to the will of the people, and it's truly annoying. Of course, there's still talk of the Russian stuff. Uh, Recently, it was said breaking that uh, Vladimir Putin of Russia ordered a quote influence campaign aimed at the U.S. election. So the CIA, FBI, or I'm sorry, I think it was the CIA, Department of Homeland Security, released their report about that stuff, saying that Russia did do things to favor Donald Trump. They did clearly point out that uh, there was no tampering with the actual results, and really they didn't have to. All they needed to do was just, as the article headline calls it, an influence campaign. That's all they needed to do was influence it. They didn't need to actually physically tamper with the ballots. And if they did, I think that it would be a little obvious and also a little hard to do. There was a number of things came out about this, especially when Trump said Trump infamously said that if he didn't win, people shouldn't accept the results of the election. There were a number of things that came out saying, well, actually tampering with the actual results of a U.S. election were incredibly difficult because elections are really run by each municipality that they occur in, and that makes sense because elections in the United States really go down as low as the local level. So, in order to really tamper with those results, they'd have to go to a lot of towns and fix the election results with, which seems highly unlikely. And speaking of that, there were some Democrats in the House that tried to challenge certification of the election, to which I say, just don't. Like, it's a useless effort, or it's a futile effort. The way you win against Trump is by actually opposing him, not continuing to make a fuss about the electoral college stuff. It's over now, unfortunately. Should we still rail against the electoral college and advocate its abolition? I think so. I've always advocated the abolition of the electoral college, even before it was cool. I think it's important that we do so because it serves, obviously it was there to prevent a demagogue from getting elected, and obviously that hasn't worked out. I also think that we should move towards uh, instant runoff slash preferential voting. You know, putting the numbers in order of which candidate, ranking the candidates in order of preference. That way, we can have an instant runoff and then actually have someone win with the majority of the votes, as they do for the mayor of London. But that's a different story. Uh, Lastly, I just want to say congrats to Trump. for walking back on your 80th campaign promise by saying that Congress is going to ask the American people to pay for his border wall with Mexico for the, quote, sake of speed, whatever the hell that means. Donald Trump obviously infamously said on the campaign that he would ask Mexico to pay for the border wall. Or no, I'm sorry. He said that Mexico will reimburse American taxpayers for the border wall for the sake of speed. That correction, that still doesn't make any freaking sense. It is not any more clear than it was earlier as to what the hell that means. I honestly, like, who is this man? Who is he? I want to say he literally, like, takes things out of his rear and presents them as whatever he wants them to be: facts, arguments, points, anything. That's just what he does. Like, who are you? How, honestly, are you just this stupid, or are you just this manipulative? I don't get it. I don't get it. Royally he must be royally stupid. Because I think that if it was a truly calculated effort, then his staff and him would have thought about it. But I think I was watching Meet the Press earlier today, and which is not something I often say. And they said that someone said on it, I want to say it was Chuck Todd, said that even Trump's press secretary says that she or he doesn't even see the tweets that he tweets out until after he's done it. He or she sees it around the same time that everybody else does. That is ridiculous. That is not having a communication team. That's having a flak cover team that even he dismisses sometimes when he's confronted about what he says and just doubles down on it. The dude's a moron. And he actually thinks that he can get away with this stuff. We have to make sure that he doesn't. Okay, lastly, real quick, I just wanted to mention, so I've become a very big fan of Jason Kander ever since that really cool ad that he put out about him taking apart a gun while he's talking about gun safety and gun control laws. And so, being the Secretary of State of Missouri, he presided over the the first day of the new legislative session, the swearing in of the Missouri legislature. Most of it decrying the voter ID law that was passed in a referendum this past November in Missouri, and warning the severe consequences of that. And I believe at one point he does rail against corruption, specifically in terms of campaign finance reform, which is, of course, my big thing. So, I'm biased because I'm a big fanboy of him, but I thought it was a really good speech. It was a really brave speech for him. I really am both A, disappointed he didn't win, and B, interested to see where he goes from here. All right, well, it's 8 o'clock. Thank you all for joining me, those of you who did. I hope this was some insightful commentary. If you have any thoughts, again, about how we can improve this channel, improve viewership, improve improved subscription, improved content, please let us know in the comments. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening. Check out my new talk show if you're from the Cape. Let's talk Cape Cod, Saturdays at 7 p.m. on my main channel, Matthew Kavitas. And remember, everybody, have malice toward none. I'll see you next Sunday.